and McConkey are going in almost the exact same spot, which McConkey was very good. These still are two very different players. One's going to have the far better quarterback in 2025. And I guess I'm still going to always be a little bit concerned about the pass volume with the Chargers coaching staff. I wasn't concerned about the competency of these guys coming in. I mean, Greg Roman, I think, even with what we've seen since, doesn't get credit for some of the things that he likes to do are not the way that I would call NFL games. But I don't think that just because you have different preferences, you can ignore the success that he has had. But you're going to have, maybe it's not true. It's easier to say at this point that the teams that have holes will fill them. But one of the things we know actually happens is that teams don't always. You have the teams that don't have running backs, and yet somebody who has Breece Hall is going to select two really good backups, and the Dallas Cowboys won't add anybody. You're going to have a lot of that as you go through. So in some ways, it makes sense for McConkey to be very expensive, assuming that some of these games in the second half of the year are very strong indications. You consistently made the point that he's the guy with the Puka Nacua background, where if he simply is on the field more, he's going to score in the way that, not necessarily in the way that Nacua did, but man, he scored a lot of points. And where he is now reflects what he did, not only in the second half of the season, but also in that playoff game with the breakaway score. It's not guaranteed that they will add the type of receiving competition that would not necessarily even push him to the side, but just make it so he's not such a clear-cut choice. So I shouldn't put it that way. Again, then these two guys are still very separated in terms of what they are as receivers. And one of the things that I think you notice when you go through and you look at your previous rankings, where you were right, where you were wrong, but also who's irrelevant going forward. And one of the things that you see when you look at the players who put up the peak efficiency seasons and one of the players who are still very serviceable, even when they have down seasons, it all comes back to talent. I like McConkey. He was much better than I expected. He looks very, very good. But we have to understand tiers and the fact that when we have some guys that we can be very confident in the talent being so epic that their ability to transcend is going to be there. But also, it's not just that they have a floor because they're so talented and the Malik Nabers had something of a floor season. But again, this whole conversation is basically about the types of ceilings that guys like Nabers and Thomas have when we now just have so much more information and then validation of incredible talent. I mean, people, I think, were vaguely skeptical even of the reported athletic numbers for these players simply because at a certain point, you know that not everyone is going to go be a superstar, right? And yet, if anything, the athletic numbers for these guys, well, they don't understate because the athletic numbers were sensational. But everything that you would want from a receiver, these guys bring.
Yeah, your point about the Nacua thing was just in relation to the targets per out run profile that, you know, I think I overlooked Brian Thomas somewhat because I was too focused on that, but I also think I had a better perception of Vlad McConkey because I was really paying attention to that, where, you know, all of his collegiate seasons were cut short for one reason or another, but they were all very consistently strong. 3 straight years of being able to earn volume at the college level, had the athletic profile, as you talked about. I felt like he could be a good NFL player. I love the way that you frame that about tiers and stuff. And I want to give a little bit of context about his season because he's another one of those rookies with the classic late season production spike. That's really exciting. But he doesn't have his first game over 70 receiving yards until October 27th. That was week 8. It was a 111-yard, 2-touchdown game against New Orleans. That was a big game and very exciting to see. The next 2 games, he doesn't have over 70 receiving yards in either. One of them, he has a 2-target, 2-catch game. Then starting 3 weeks beyond that, so in week 11, is when things really took off for him. So from week 11 on, including that postseason game, he goes over 80 yards in, 7 of his final 8 games. And so as far as like recency bias and those things, and this is what we do at this time of year, we remember this. This is what Ladd McConkey did to close the year, 80-plus yards in 7 of 8 games. And most importantly, that playoff game winds up with 197 yards, because of a little bit of a broken play, frankly, but an 86-yard touchdown. But not just because of that. Obviously, he had 111 yards beyond the 86-yard touchdown, but that was late. That was in a game where they were already, massively losing and pressing, and he makes an incredible play. You don't want to take that away from him, but it is elevating the profile around him that he did that in their one postseason game, I think, especially right now. When people dig into the numbers a little bit more, they see the whole season. They see that in whatever it is, 6 or 7 of his first 8 games, he was at 70 yards or below 70 receiving yards. And he is this rookie that has this great late season push and breakout, and that does typically excite you for year 2. He finishes with a 2.38 yards per out run on the year. He only finishes with a 22.8% targets per out run, though. His yards per target really strong. It will remain strong because he has Justin Herbert, but he already played with Justin Herbert. He already got that yards per target boost. When we compare him to Malik Nabers, I was talking about how Nabers earned all this volume, was a focal point, got everything from the beginning, had 30 catches in his second, third, and fourth games combined in the NFL. Nabers wasn't putting up even 50 yards in most of those games right out of the gate, right? It's just a different animal. Nabers was dealing with having no quarterback already and the 7.1 yards per target and still producing more than Ladd. He had 1,204 yards in 15 games, was top 10 in yards. Him and Lamb both finished in the top 10 with 15 games played. McConkey was the only other receiver who finished in the top 10 with fewer than 17 games. He played 16 games, but he was in 10th at 1149, about 50 plus yards behind Nabers in one more game played, which is a gap. That is a meaningful separation there. And again, that came in a season where McConkey had a 10 plus yards per target because he was playing with Justin Herbert and was super efficient. And if you add in his playoff game, he had an even bigger yards per target, right? He was incredibly efficient in that game. There was peak production from him already tied to his QB. People love to double count. Well, he's got Herbert. That's why you think he's good in part. That's because he had Herbert last year. He put up 1,150 yards. He's very good. Targets per out run profile is very strong. He's going to go on to have a good year. He was the immediate star in an offense that doesn't have a lot of competition. As you noted, that doesn't mean that they're going to add more, but there's a possibility of that. He wasn't super dominant from a target earning profile perspective. A lot to love about him. A year 2 profile you want to buy into, but that huge playoff game, I think, is really making sure that you're not getting a discount on him at all. He should be going later than in the Malik Nabers range for sure. That is really, really frothy for Ladd McConkey and what he is, and the fact that he had a good rookie year, but is not a lock to be in the top 10 wide receivers in the NFL over the next several years or what have you. I mean, that's what it feels like Nabers is right now. So
I'll probably rescind this at some point, Ben. It probably isn't correct, but as you're talking through it, it feels to me like McConkey is the year 2 version of what Marvin Harrison was a year ago, the rookie version, where the enthusiasm for some of the things we know. With Harrison, it was that, rookies are scoring and he is a superstar prospect. Let's put him at this point where there's no really room to outperform and a lot of risk. With McConkey, we know that year 2 guys blow up. We know that we undervalued some of those guys in 2024, and we're looking to remedy that or to get ahead of something there with him that isn't, not that it's not there, but that it does create a lot of risk for you at that point. The other thing that I was thinking as you went through that was that he played some of these games injured, and perhaps the production would have been even better healthy. It possibly cuts a little bit both ways in that we did continue to see some concern about his viability from a health perspective. I don't know that we have enough insight into, even with all the great injury research over the last 4 or 5 years and the knowledge that certainly previous injuries that have hurt your physicality are going to be problematic. Guys who have struggled to stay healthy, there probably is a little bit of elevated risk there. He's not a big guy in a league where people are gigantic and incredibly athletic, and that does put you at a little bit of risk. He managed to play most of the games, and he managed to play hurt as well sometimes. Hopefully what we see now is a long stretch of good health, and he just is a superstar.
Yeah, that would be Awesome to see from him. The last receiving stat that I have down, but sparks a lot of interesting conversations, is touchdowns. And we know that touchdowns matter a lot for fantasy, right? But they also have outsized weight sometimes in the way that we look back on seasons. You, over the years, especially with young players, have emphasized that we shouldn't just completely throw them out, because some of the sort of new age thought is like, well, it doesn't matter that they scored touchdowns. All we're focused on is yardage. Great example of that is Brian Thomas's final prospect season, where you're a little bit concerned about the target earning as opposed to, hey, look at all these yards and touchdowns he had. Those things are good. You love to kind of straightforwardly say to me often off the air, touchdowns are good. They're a good thing. We shouldn't just ignore them. Jordan Addison, a name who you talked about that a lot with last year after 10 touchdowns in his rookie year. He came back with 9 in his second year, because sometimes these kinds of things, they're not necessarily super sticky or predictive for the whole sample, but they are evidence of a player is just really good at doing this thing. He's really good at scoring touchdowns. And Addison is a player I want to talk to you about, because he's a guy that, for the whole season, another one where you get sort of similar to the JSN thing, you get the progression throughout the season of a year 2 player who, like JSN, was a 21-year-old rookie. His age 22 season this year, the first 7 games he played, he had more than 5 targets once. After that point, he never had fewer than 6 in 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 games. He had 8+ in 7 of those 9 games. So it just completely flips, right? He's a 4 or 5 target per game guy. Suddenly he's an 8 target a game guy. And in that gap, in that time period, and you've talked about this a lot, but as I was doing my targets per out run piece, I pulled some of this together. In that time period, he had 70 targets to only 80 for Justin Jefferson. He had a targets per out run of 20.6%, which was a little higher than his full season number, more down in the 18% range. Jefferson was down to a 22.2%, lower than his full season number. Addison was emerging as a legitimate star second player in this passing game. Again, this is a guy who won a Biletnikoff at like age 19, then went to a different school and was great, then was great as a rookie, first round pick. People don't think of Jordan Addison as a star in his own right because he's the Robin to Jefferson's Batman, but you've called him a top 20 receiver in the entire NFL, essentially. I mean, if we start thinking about him like he's a superstar in his own right, and this team just has 2 of them, that's great. That's good for the Vikings. And it also helps you contextualize what Jordan Addison's been able to do, and especially over the second half of the year, how he was able to pull volume away from Justin Jefferson. I mean, usually you're thinking, can he just elevate over the other guys in the offense? But he became almost on par with Jefferson in volume earning, at least.
He did. And one of the things that I ran across when I was doing some additional research on recent prospects for some comps types of elements, and just also trying to make sure I understood what the young receivers were in college. Because as we're looking at first-year guys, as we're looking at second-year guys, it's not that you're looking at their college numbers and saying, oh, this is going to definitely predict what happens in the future. But it's always valuable, I think, to understand what a receiver is, what he does, what his strengths are, what you're going to need to have happen for him to have a successful season. And Addison was a more successful vertical receiver in college than I realized, even knowing that he put up those, video game numbers at Pittsburgh before the transfer, wins the Biletnikoff, as you mentioned. He's a vertical guy, and that matters, especially off of Justin Jefferson, because if you get competent QB play, it's going to be very difficult to take away both players. If you're a vertical threat, if you're a touchdown threat, if you probably would be a big target earner in your own right without a Justin Jefferson kind of stomping on your potential volume, then yeah, maybe you can't score at the level you otherwise would. But I do think it creates the possibility for these efficiency explosions that we tend to think of as being more valuable maybe in DFS, but certainly at the same time in best ball are valuable. But you also think of a guy who can go on a run and carry you in redraft. And a number of our teams, when they made the push in FFPC and won their leagues, got into interesting positions to then be viable in the sprint, it was because Addison went on a run and gave us an additional weapon. So it's important to keep that in mind as well, just what it does for you in fantasy when this guy can go off. In addition to the numbers he actually put up, Addison was interesting because he was 7th in DPI yards. Justin Jefferson first. When you think about what these two guys did, they also added a ton of value to their team because they put up almost 300 yards in pass interferences that they picked up. So, you add those numbers to his totals and they look good. You add those numbers, if you want, when you're looking at his air yards, the air yards numbers, good there. The other thing, and you sort of hinted at this, but it's maybe even more than the situation with JSN, where, I would like to think that what he did when DK Metcalf was out was so impressive that your first thought is that JSN is going to be the focal point. He's going to be what this new offensive coordinator builds the offense around. They're going to figure out better ways to get him involved. We know that Geno Smith throws one of the best balls in the NFL, but does tend to take his early read. You want that early read to be JSN, and you want it to have a vertical component. Probably that will be the case this year. Jordan Addison was not close to 100% early in the season. He comes in injured with an ankle injury. He suffers a subsequent ankle injury. He misses time. He plays at less than 100%. And then once he gets going, he's this massive force, and he does it with and alongside Justin Jefferson, and even in many cases alongside TJ Hawkinson. I don't think that we have much reason to believe that Addison is anything other than a star and someone who will carry this over, even though this is yet another team where we have QB uncertainty. I saw a strange dynasty trade come across, if you want to call it the desk or what have you the other day, where someone had moved Jaden Daniels for some really good player that I don't remember, like the 111 and JJ McCarthy. And my first thought was, you would need 15 more things for me to part with Jaden Daniels. But my other thought was JJ McCarthy is extremely appealing, even if he's not that great, right? Because he's going to be playing in a dome, in a shootout division with receivers that are sensationally good. I think that Justin Jefferson and Jordan Addison are easily the best 1-2 punch in the NFL. And then you have a great coordinator.
And then you have I was just going to throw out TJ Hawkinson coming off an ACL, rehab extended well in the season, all that. He comes out and posts a 19.7% targets per route, 7.7 yards per target, right in his normal range. His targets per route was down a little bit, but not bad. It's okay. It gives you this okay for a tight end, 1.52 yards per route run. It's more like what he used to do in Detroit than the ceiling we'd seen in Minnesota. But coming off the injury and missing most of the season, you're thinking the beginning of that sample is, look, he's not even fully healthy. It's a pretty decent year for him. I noted that he strikes me as a little overvalued. His early ADP is tight end 6. When you think about the emergence of Addison, but when you think about McCarthy, you also get TJ Hawkinson in there. And then as you were finishing, Kevin O'Connell as well. Kevin O'Connell just made Sam Darnold into a great quarterback. McCarthy's going to be this quarterback class, Sean, is going to look so incredible in a year or two. I don't know if McCarthy's going to be a star long term, but what if he's a star? That's just a whole nother thing. But he's going to look better than he is in a year or two, is my point, regardless, for what you just said, for those reasons as well. And this is the quarterback class that rejuvenates the whole NFL. It gets me excited to think about. But Daniels in May, and now that you got Ben Johnson with Caleb Williams, I'm a lot more excited about where that's going to go. We think both Bo Nix and now Michael Penix look like they're going to be serviceable to very good quarter. There's going to be 6 good quarterbacks out of this class. It's awesome.
Yeah, we'll get to the Penix thing in the future, but I try to remind myself that the actual stat lines were not as good as what I saw just watching what I felt watching him throw the ball, and that they were against terrible, terrible defenses in a dome. So it's set up very nicely, but man, did he look good. Well, we will be going through some really fun QB numbers soon, Ben. Do you have a guy here in this touchdown category?
Yeah,
that I got you really want to focus on? Mark Andrews 11, despite, as you mentioned, only the 55 catches. Terry McLaurin, I keep referring to Terry McLaurin as a really good number 2, and he seems like a guy to me where it's the QB and it's the complete dearth of other receiving options. But then I'm looking at the numbers. I'm like, Shawn, is ludicrous that you keep referring to him as an elite number 2 and that they need a number 1. Jamar Chase, are we going to get 20? Where are you with some of these TD guys?
McLaurin's the one that I would want to talk about. But yeah, the TD numbers, I started at Addison. He had 9. The other guy I have down here that I kind of want your thoughts on is Rashad Bateman also had 9. Kind of exciting thing for him as a guy that had a really nice prospect profile. Obviously has not lived up to that. But a 9 TD season is very notable. There's only 8 players in the league with over 10 receiving TDs. So Addison, Bateman tied for 9th. I was kind of looking through the top 10s of the different positions. At the top, we have Jamar Chase with 17 touchdowns. And you just said, can you get 20? I mean, we'll see, right? McLaurin was second with 13. I want to talk about McLaurin. You have Amon-Ra at 12. It's so fascinating. Mark Andrews had 11 because to your point, I mean, what I wrote here, the 69 targets, 55 catches. He had a touchdown for every 5th catch, 11 TDs and 55 catches. That's an absurd number. A 20%, touchdown to reception ratio is out of control high. It's also, it's evidence of what we talked about last offseason, that they didn't want to make Andrews necessarily a focal point in this offense. It doesn't mean he's bad. And one of the things we did see is, well, they'd made him a focal point in the red zone, right? It's just like sort of usage dictated his production to a degree. T. Higgins is the other one I noted among the 8 players with over 10 touchdowns because he only played 12 games and 10 touchdowns in 12 games. Had a really nice season as well. And he's kind of that other example of the guy where we've talked about him as if he's a star, a co-number 1 in his own right alongside Jamar Chase. He's the guy that I always think about when we talk about Addison, that we sometimes talk about Higgins on those terms. Or, I mean, obviously we've talked about it with like Devonta Smith alongside AJ Brown or Jalen Waddle in the past alongside Tyreek Hill, but who knows what's going on with his career after a down season. But anyway, McLaurin is the one I want to talk about, Shawn, because you said it very well, I thought. Whether he's a number 1 or number 2 is a very interesting conversation. My comments on him throughout his whole career has been that he's been very good, but probably not as great as some people believe. He's always had not elite number 1 alpha targets per out run numbers. And I think that's meaningful. He's had high ADOTs and people will mention that. And that's true. His weight, I use weighted targets per out run as well. His weighted targets per out run looks better than his targets per out run. It still doesn't look elite. He doesn't earn massive amounts of volume. This year, he had an incredible year. 13 TDs in all this. 1.98 yards per out run is very good, but it's not elite. We were just talking about some of those rookies that had great seasons up over 2. The stars are up over 2.5, or in some cases they can run yards per out runs that are 3+. AJ Brown pushed that number this year. He's been over 2.5 every year of his career. Jamar Chase has been over 2.5 almost every year of his career. Justin Jefferson, I think, had a career low yards per out run this year at 2.4. Now, I'm not saying McLaurin has to be as high as those guys, but what I am saying is that people are doing the double counting thing with Jaden Daniels here a little bit. People are saying he's got Jaden Daniels. He's Jaden Daniels number 1. In some ways, 2024 was McLaurin's best opportunity to have a monster year. He already had Jaden Daniels playing at almost an MVP level. I mean, Jaden Daniels very well could get even better, but there's also risk. We saw with CJ Stroud. I'm not saying that's going to happen with Daniels. I think Daniels is a little bit different than Stroud, and the challenges he puts on defenses and all those types of things. But Daniels could also get injured. There's so many things that could happen. He had a mostly healthy. Daniels did have a stretch where he was banged up and didn't throw downfield well, but a mostly healthy Jaden Daniels all season who played at an incredibly high level. And the idea that because McLaurin has Daniels, he's going to be even better in 2025 implies that you're going to get more out of Jaden Daniels than you got in 2024. And what I'm trying to argue is that's probably not likely. That's probably a positive outcome for Daniels to be even better in 2025, that there's a lot of scenarios where he maybe takes a small step back or isn't healthy or is just the same guy. And in this year where he got a good Jaden Daniels season, 1.98 yards per out run, 20.8% targets per out run is just not that dominant of a number 1 season. He had a good yards per target, good after the target efficiency. He always has. This has been his thing. Low 20s targets per out, sometimes even high teens, but not 25+, not 27, not 29 like Malik Nabers was at, 21% targets per out. And then good efficiency after the target because he's good. He's good ball skills, all of those things, the kind of thing that we talked about with Brian Thomas, but not otherworldly like Brian Thomas in the efficiency category either. His career high in yards per out run is 2.05. Again, 1.98 here this year. He's been up over 1.8 in 5 of 6 years. I was talking about 1.8 as being good, but not as high as I wanted to see it when we talked about JSN. That's McLaurin's range has been 1.8 to like 205 in yards per out run. That's not the only stat that matters. It's a good contextual stat to say he's good. Those are good ranges. It's consistently very strong that he's able to do that every year. And I know he's had bad quarterback play for a lot of it, but he's never been elite. And the reason he's never been elite is because that targets per out run is a major part of yards per out run. And he's never earned 25% targets per route, or a target on 25% of his routes, which is a big difference between, that gap between 20 and 25% is massive. If you think about a target on every 5th route or a target on every 4th route, I mean, that's just a big, big difference as far as how it manifests over the course of a full season. He turns 30 in September as well, Shawn. That's the other reason that you want to look at him and say, 2024 when he was 29 was a big deal. He was an older prospect. He hasn't been in the league that long. I don't think people realize he's going to be playing at age 30 next year. His early ADP is in the middle of the 3rd round. He's the 13th wide receiver off the board early this offseason. For me to further emphasize how people are drafting him and double counting the Jane Daniels thing, note that he was wide receiver 16 this year while playing 17 games, wide receiver 16 in points per game. So the games played doesn't matter as much, but wide receiver 16 in PPR. I'm pulling the 13th wide receiver off the board off Underdog, which is half PPR, and it's going to favor touchdowns a little more. So that's an important caveat. But in PPR, wide receiver 16 in points per game in a season where he scored 13 receiving TDs. So I'm not even saying we have to ignore the receiving TDs. They do matter. He did score them all. He was 2nd in the league in receiving TDs, and he's being drafted higher than that going into his age 30 season when he's never really had a year that shows that he can be better than wide receiver 13 in actual production. When you're drafting a guy in the middle of the 3rd round, you want him to be a 1st round wide receiver. We talk about this every year. His price is the one you were talking about, Ladd. His price is the one for me early on. And he had a great year. Scored a lot of touchdowns. I think he'll be good again next year. Scored TDs in their postseason games is good. Is going to be good next year with Daniels. But the other reason that this year was his year to score was he didn't have the target competition. Their biggest job this offseason is get Jane Daniels more weapons, right? Zach Ertz and Olamide Zaccheaus are your secondary downfield weapons. I mean, if he couldn't have earned 22, 23, 25% targets per route in this version of the offense, why are we assuming that he's going to be even better as a default, as an ADP than he was last year? Again, in a year where he scored 13 touchdowns. It's his price makes really no sense. And I do think he has a high floor, but you don't just take guys in the middle of the 3rd round because they're going to have a high floor.
That's a tricky one. I'm looking at the target numbers here. As I was thinking simultaneously to you going through that'll be interesting to watch what the Commanders do. We've gotten slightly different approaches from some of these teams that are juggernauts and that have the star QBs. And then if you want to subdivide that a little further, the hybrid QBs, the Eagles went out and even having Devontae Smith, who probably is a similar level of player to Terry McLaurin, they added a star on top of him in A.J. Brown. Then they add Saquon Barkley on top of that. You think about the Ravens where their biggest addition is Derrick Henry, but they have Mark Andrews, Rashad Bateman, who had kind of failed to that point in place. They go out, they add a Zay Flowers in the draft in the 1st round to try and get more dynamic, to be better in the passing offense. They change that coordinator. They go out. Lamar Jackson has this historic season where his passing numbers are pretty absurd when you know what he also does with his legs. You have all of those pieces then in the Ravens offense. The Bills a little bit different in that they decide that Stephon Diggs is a cancer and or is getting to the edge of being washed. And so you just, especially if you have some concerns about the other part, you're going to maybe take that step away early as opposed to holding on too long. They do make a move for Keon Coleman. We talked a little bit about how that hasn't worked yet. Coleman, perhaps someone who could emerge later. But you think about where the Commanders are in their development, and they just arrived so early because Jaden Daniels is so impossibly good. Their next step is to add at these other positions, you would think, and to fill out and to create the kind of juggernaut around him that the Eagles have, that the Ravens have. That would step on the potential volume for McLaurin. But even in this situation where McLaurin is there more or less by himself and Flowers is in this offense where people were very enthusiastic about Mark Andrews, you do actually have a little bit of a bounce back to relevance and even occasional dynamism from Rashad Bateman. You mentioned the touchdowns that he scores. You have Derrick Henry and obviously Lamar Jackson eating up so many of the touchdowns there. So in the end, Zay Flowers only scores the 4 touchdowns, but the numbers are pretty striking when you think about the difference in target competition. Flowers with a slightly higher target share, their total number of targets, 117, 116. Flowers actually catches fewer passes than McLaurin did, but averages more yards per reception. I wouldn't have necessarily guessed that because of how vertically dynamic McLaurin is. I do think the touchdowns matter. I do think that we can probably count on McLaurin to be better from a touchdown perspective than Flowers, but Flowers is a guy that when you look at where these two players are and what the valuations are likely to be, I mean, perhaps Flowers. Some of it is just that I have some Flowers and would like him to take the next step, and he's going to be someone who perhaps has a more exploitable outlook for 2025. But you think about the big gap there in yards after the catch. You think about what a Flowers does. I think it's pretty striking that when you consider the differences in target competition, that the target share was better for Flowers. The numbers outside of touchdowns are almost identical. Yeah, I mean, touchdowns for me are a big part of it. I think that it's easy to overlook how important it is for players to have that in their range of outcomes, right? You want to be drafting players where even if you know it's going to bounce around a lot year to year, that you're picking guys, especially as you look at value related to ADP, where you think that their touchdowns could beat ADP as you're thinking about the different components of scoring and what that means as it relates to where guys are being drafted. I don't know. Yeah, I love McLaurin. I love what he did this season. I think he actually did help Daniels in a way that we shouldn't overlook, right? That's going to work back the other direction too. Having a dominant, dynamic, what have you, vertical receiver does allow a QB to do things that you simply can't do if you don't have a guy who can run deep, because throwing over the top, especially in this day and age, I mean, we saw what happened with the Chiefs where when they kept missing to Xavier Worthy, that was a big storyline in their season. And it's one of the reasons why people think they're overrated, because they didn't make those plays that would have made them look better. Yeah, I mean, I'm of two minds of it, because I don't want to not give McLaurin credit for those TDs, but there are red flags in the future.
Even if you're giving him credit, he's turning 30, he may have more competition, and he's being drafted higher than where he was with those TDs. I mean, he's being drafted wide receiver 13. You mentioned Flowers, he's wide receiver 22. I would want Flowers straight up over McLaurin. The guys in that gap, just to give the listeners a little bit of an idea, because they haven't really probably seen a whole lot of early ADP necessarily. Well, the guy right ahead of McLaurin, I just mentioned, is T. Higgins, which is interesting to me. Behind him is Garrett Wilson and JSN right behind him. DJ Moore, we talked about. These guys are all going right behind McLaurin. Tyreek Hill and Mike Evans, age stuff, etc. But I mean, especially Tyreek Hill. We know what the ceiling is there in a healthy year. If you don't want the older receivers, then right behind those two, you have Marvin Harrison and Xavier Worthy. Some year 2 potential breakout guys. Again, McLaurin has been around for 6-7 years. We know a lot about what he is. And you have Devonta Smith, and then you have Zay Flowers at wide receiver 22. On the Flowers point, he's another one that really popped on the targets per out run stuff as I look through the stuff, because, he did have a weird year to a certain degree, but 23.8% targets per out runs, really strong. It's a big bump from his rookie year, about 4 years about 4 percentage points higher than his rookie year, while adding about 2 yards of ADOT. So he does get a lot of the short area targets, and that does inflate things for him. That is important context on his targets per route. But he was at 19.9% as a rookie at an 8.8 ADOT. He went up to 23.8% at a 10.7 ADOT. Almost 4 percentage points higher, 2 yards of ADOT. Really nice boost to like his overall air yards profile, weighted targets per out, however you want to look at that. It meant that he had a 2.25 yards per out run this year. He went up to a range that Terry McLaurin's never really even sniffed. I just mentioned his career high is 205. I mean, he's not been up anywhere near the 2.25 range. I mean, yeah, it's somewhat near, but those gaps are meaningful. The difference between 2 and 2.5 yards per out run is a lot. And Flowers is halfway there. And McLaurin's never really even been, he's been the closest he's been is a tenth of the way there. So anyway, it's for me, what you mentioned with Flowers is it all checks out. He's a guy who it wasn't the peak statistical season for him, but he showed everything in year 2 that makes you think that peak statistical season can come together in a future year and be really exciting, especially if the touchdowns go his way. As you noted, they didn't. Mark Andrews had a ton on a very limited role. We talked about Bateman having 9, and you just mentioned those guys, but Flowers is a young player, could be something better than what we think he is right now. I'm not saying McLaurin can't continue to get better, but again, the point I like to drive home with these guys that have played a lot of years and are, is entering his age 30 year and has never done anything more than what I'm saying. I know he's never had a quarterback. He had a good one this year and he didn't necessarily take off. Maybe he has a career year at age 30. Typically we have a good idea of what this player is at this point. Market's telling you that they think he's like Cooper Kupp. I mean, not that he would have to be as good as Cooper Kupp, but there are guys who have had the late season elite turn, right? Then they had that elite. Well, now I'm actually so much better than I was for the rest of. I said late season, I meant late career, and that would be the comp. Would be a guy who, if you go look at Cooper Kupp all the way up until age 29 or whatever, you're not thinking that he's going to suddenly have the greatest wide receiver season of all time. And I don't think the market's telling you that McLaurin has to do that, but that would be the comp. Somebody who turned it up to an elite level late in his career. Maybe that's there for McLaurin. To me, all of those names I listed, the 10 names after him, and not every single one of them, but the majority of them are guys that I want to bet on to have a similar floor production with McLaurin, because I would, I guess, as a default, expect his 13 TDs to come down, and then also more ceiling. More potential to be superstars. Marvin Harrison can't come back. I mean, everyone was taking him at the 1-2 turn last year. Yeah, we have some concerns long-term, but his yards per out run, targets per out run profile don't say he can't play. It was not what people wanted right out of the gate, but they're going to build the whole offense around him this offseason. They need him to be more than what he was in year 1. It's his first full offseason. He doesn't have all the weight of getting drafted and all of those things. Maybe he comes out and has a great year 2, right? Maybe Xavier Worthy takes it to the next level. Maybe Garrett Wilson or JSN monster seasons. Maybe Tyreek Hill gets back to what he is. There's a lot of maybes there, but
I may not be looking at Rashee Rice's injury correctly, but I guess I'm surprised that he is going behind Terry McLaurin, and they're not even, frankly, in the same general vicinity. And the thing with Flowers, right, is that even if you are a little bit more, and I think probably most people are kind of in this range where you do think there's something to the touchdowns, and that Bateman, because of the vertical ability, Andrews, because he's always been an efficient player and a great tight end, likely because he is a mismatch, and you can't really account for him if you're trying to account for the other guys, that a lot of those things touchdown-wise that show up could continue to make it difficult for Flowers to get the numbers that would really make him an impact guy, especially in formats where touchdowns are very important. And yet, to me, you talk about the different levels that he's getting the targets at. I mentioned the yards after the catch. I think if you're getting a lot of those underneath targets to round out a profile, which is hugely helpful overall, but just especially then in PPR, right? If you're dynamic once you catch the ball, then that's something to be extremely excited about. This has a little bit of a Stephon Diggs sleeping giant kind of a feel to me with him. The early ADP is fun. I mean, Jerry Jeudy is someone we have hinted at. he seems like he's going well below what his overall profile and what he did this past year would justify.
I'll tell you who I think is the biggest value of all, which we went over the guys that had, their full season numbers mostly stayed healthy and those types of things. You get some injury discounts early in the off season, and there's fear around this, and there should be. But Chris Olave only ran 188 routes this year, had some concussions, and then they ended up just shutting him down for the whole rest of the year. And I think rightfully so after a second concussion and their season wasn't going anywhere. Maybe there's some small risk that he's done playing. I'm not sure. But presuming that he's back, he should be back fully healthy from a physical standpoint. The mental health, the concussion, the brain health stuff is stuff that we obviously are concerned about. But I'll give a name. Brandon Cooks for years was having a lot of concussions, and I started to fade him in fantasy a little because I was like, one concussion, it could be the end of his career. I think that's the feeling around Chris Olave right now. I don't know if that's actually the way it works. The reason I bring up Cooks is Cooks has been able to play a lot longer. Give him the whole off season, give him some time away and time to heal, and he's already had a lot of time to end the regular season. He missed a lot of time. And he started practicing late in the year. He was back with the team. He didn't ever get activated. I do think he's going to play this year. I think when he plays, Chris Olave started his career with now 3 straight years of 2+ yards per out run, 2.42, 207, 213. Way back in Deebo Samuel's third year, Sean, we talked about starting. Our buddy Pat Crane pulled this stat. I remember back then that Deebo had started with 2 straight years of 2+ yards per out run. And that was a promising thing, even though he hadn't necessarily got out into enough routes. He'd been banged up a lot. That's the year 3 in 2001 or 2021 when he was a star. Same year that Cooper Kupp broke out. Both those guys were the keys to fantasy builds that year. Kupp was the pick in around round 4, and Deebo in like round 7 or round 8 ADP going into year 3 that year. The stat was that if you start your career with 2 straight yards per out run seasons over 2, that cohort is just elite. It's not very large, and it's elite. It's like it started with like he went back like a decade. It started with the AJ Green and Julio Jones names in that class, and then every year coming up to the Deebo class was just stars. And I always keep that in the back of my mind that if you can come out and on a per route basis start with multiple yards per out run seasons over 2, you're probably a very, very good wide receiver. I mentioned that guys like AJ Brown have been able to do it over 2.5 over multiple seasons. Olave now has 3 straight years. He was over 2 yards per out run when he went down this year. His targets per out had fallen a little bit. His yards per target was actually at a career high. He was efficient. He was doing some better things. His ADOT had come down a little bit. Small sample, 188 routes, but was still playing at a really, really high level. This guy's probably a really good football player. He's going in the 6th round in early drafts because people are concerned about, obviously, the concussions, which they should be. But that's like 3 rounds too late. Chris Olave should be going in the 3rd round. Anyway, that's my pitch.
I like that. My concern would be if the Saints are contracted and their players are not going to allowed on other teams.
It's a fair point. We don't even know whose coach is going to be. It sounds like it might be Kellen Moore. Who knows?
They're like $1.5 trillion over the salary cap.
They may not matter. They may not even exist. We're not sure. That might not be a team anymore.
Ben Jalen Waddle has an ADP. That one is a little bit difficult to understand. One of the things you mentioned with Olave.
That he has an ADP at all? That somebody drafted him?
Right. I mean, it's a real ADP. It's not a last round flyer.
Oh my God, it's ahead of Chris Olave, 57.7. It's in the 5th round.
Roma Dunze still has a fairly enthusiastic ADP. One of the reasons I like your Chris Olave note, but it doesn't just apply to him, obviously. Again, it's very likely that my view on this will shift or at least become more nuanced and have a better feel for where some of these guys will fit and make a difference. But as potent and deep and incredibly exciting as the running back class is, the rookie wide receiver class doesn't look that way, especially if one of the 2 obvious superstars doesn't get it doesn't get enough work on offense, right? You can be very good. If you're not running a lot of routes, then you would need to score touchdowns constantly in order to balance that out. If you don't get that rookie wave this season, then some of these guys like Olave, and then if you get a bounce back from a Jalen Waddle, if you get a completely different type of performance from an Adunze, with the upgraded coaching staff, then those are going to be very big deals if you don't have, again, this similar level of impact from rookies that we have generally gotten over the most recent campaigns.
That makes sense. The rookie you're referring to that may not run a ton of routes, obviously Travis Hunter, he's going in the 140s because people think he might not even play wide receiver at all.
I'm comfortable taking that risk.
I am too. We talked about it a little on ship chasing last week, and people are making this decision based on scouts saying he's a more natural corner, and they think he's a better bet to play corner and all of those things. My argument on ship chasing was Travis Hunter is going to have a say in this. He's going to come out at some point and say, I want to play on both sides of the ball. If you're drafting me, you draft. Players don't just want to be nobodies, basically, right? Like he really wanted to win the Heisman, and that mattered a lot to him. Played for Dion, followed Dion to a second school. Dion, probably the last player to successfully play on both sides of the ball. He had that year for the Cowboys where he played receiver basically the whole year, played on both sides of the ball. Big reason why that connection was there in the college level. Travis Hunter wanted to win the Heisman, did win the Heisman, wants to be great pretty clearly. I think this guy is going to want to play on both sides of the ball at the NFL level. He has a chance to be the Shohei Ohtani of football. We really think he's just going to be like, yeah, I'm cool playing cornerback and not playing wide receiver at all. Now your point is the right way to think about it. I think, how many routes does he run, right? Like how much is he playing on both sides of the ball? But he's young, man. If he's telling you he wants to play on both sides of the ball, I guess I don't think it's impossible that you could see this guy out there for quite a few snaps on both sides of the ball. Might have to take some more plays off than most starters, Well,
why wouldn't you use him in high leverage on both if he can play both, right? If he can mentally prepare for it. It's almost as much a mental preparation with the NFL being so complicated and there being so much information to digest and to understand. And we talk sometimes about
the meeting
really
rooms,
liking
the preparation.
It's probably not our favorite approach to have an offensive scheme where you truly are tipping run pass through personnel. But we already have plenty of receivers who are going to mostly play, are going to play on more downs that are pass downs, and you might take them out for some of the block. We see that with JSN, where if they're going to go to a running play and the defense already knows it's a running play, they just play other receivers, right? You can manage the reps a little bit and still make him a focal point of your offense. And then, defensively, what are the key plays, right? If you think he's an impact defender and he can play medium, third long without breaking the rest of the defense because you need to have some continuity. And again, you have plenty of substitution and different specific down and distance packages already. Why wouldn't you use him to make the crucial stops? You think back to these Chiefs-Bills games and how almost everything comes down to whether the defense can get off the field once they've created a third and medium, a third and long. If the guy is that good, and we have every reason to believe he is, use him on the snaps that matter on both sides.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. It'll be really fascinating, though, because I think you did make a really good point at the beginning of that, where you said, the learning of everything and just the way the weeks go and the install and everything. And when they go into the position groups, he can't be in the wide receiver room and the cornerback room at the same time, right? And so, physically throughout the season, being able to learn everything that they need to teach these different groups when they break at practice into their different groups is probably the biggest hurdle overall. But obviously he did it to some degree in college, right? Like he was able to learn those things. And obviously whoever drafts him, they're drafting him very high. It's a huge investment, and they're going to be willing to consider things that they can do to make it work because they want to consider that. And everything you read about this kid is he's an incredibly hard worker. And there's a lot of people in the fantasy football industry that are like, well, the scouts are saying he's a better cornerback, so he's not going to play receiver. And I think Travis Hunter's going to have something to say about that. I think Travis Hunter's going to want to be exceptional. He's going to want to win an MVP, be the first non-QB to win an MVP in years. And the way you do that is you play on both sides of the ball, a ton of snaps, and you're a Pro Bowl level player on both sides of the ball. And he arguably can be that.
Well, and this is not to denigrate the defenders in any way, shape, or form. Thankfully, we do get plenty of coverage of defenders, especially if they're as good as, say, like a Deion Sanders. Although, again, Deion is so unique that even Travis Hunter, I think, probably is enough different because he's not Deion Sanders, who, athletically just so superior to almost every person who has ever walked the planet. But if you're thinking about, like, could I be Justin Jefferson, Jamar Chase, Randy Moss, maybe even someone not quite to that level, or could I be Charles Woodson? The reason that Charles Woodson name pops to mind is that he is someone who got all of this coverage, won all of these awards, considered to be an all-time great player, but it still is a little bit different. And when the player gets a chance to be involved in those conversations, receiver is very, very high profile.
Yeah, it's incredibly high profile. It'll be fascinating to see what happens with his career. It's fun to get a little quick discussion on him at the end of this show because he's one that, we're getting an opportunity to see something this offseason and into next year and the way that it'll impact the NFL for the next decade that has a really wide range of outcomes that includes some truly special things that we've never seen before that could be, just about to kick off and start. And I wish him the best. I hope he does all of it, and you're all, as you're talking through the high profile nature of the wide receiver position, I was also thinking through, especially when I say he's young, like we know how much players care about that second contract. Right. And maybe he's not doing it when he's 28, but he's coming in the NFL young. And if he's going to do it, I think you do it through your rookie contract and then you get a quarterback contract. And then, you probably still do it during that quarterback contract, but at a certain point you're playing situationally or whatever. But in these next 4 or 5 years, that's when you think he's doing it the most because he's trying to earn the largest non-quarterback contract of all time by tens of millions of dollars. And he can earn that if he goes out and does it if he plays at a Pro Bowl level on both sides of the ball. There's also great prospects that are busts, right? Can he definitely play at a Pro Bowl level at both sides of the ball? Of course, that's not a definite thing. No, but that's in the range of possibilities. People said it wasn't possible for Shohei Ohtani to do what he's done. And we've seen now that he is literally an MVP hitter and also a potential Cy Young pitcher in the same body. And that's crazy. It's impossible to comprehend. And it's impossible to comprehend for Travis Hunter what his ceiling actually is. That's why I say it's a wide range of outcomes. That doesn't mean he's going to do that. But if he's able, even situationally, to play those two positions both at a really high level and an exceptionally high level, by the time he becomes a free agent 4 or 5 years down the line and is, been franchise tagged or whatever, you're talking about contracts that aren't fathomable, right? Like you're talking about probably whatever team drafts him is going to pay him whatever he wants to have. But really not even 4 years down the road. You're talking about a couple years down the road when he becomes eligible for an extension that they're going to extend him and they're going to give him a deal that's bigger than any player at either position because that's just going to be the discussion point. Again, if he can play at that level on both sides of the ball, but that's what he's going to strive for or want. There's just no reason why he wouldn't. That's what his agent's going to want. That's what his team's going to want for him. That's what Deion Sanders was grooming him for in college. That's what that was all about. He won the Heisman doing that. Like, where's the feedback where it's like, I have to pick one? No, I did both in college and I won the Heisman. Like, why do I have to pick? What do you mean I have to pick? It's crazy.
Yeah, I love that.
I'm excited. I'm excited about it.
It should be exciting. And you think, I was just thinking, and some people who are more familiar with him probably be like, I mean, he's way better than this. But you think about the Chiefs, he could be both McDuffie and Worthy at the same time, and think about just how valuable that is. And then one of the things we've been frustrated about this season and over the last several seasons is that the way the NFL works now, I mean, there are some things you can do to limit plays, to limit possessions. If you limit plays, one of the things that never exactly took off at the NFL level are some of these lightning fast offenses, because they create so many plays and the potential for your defense to have to play so many plays. Those things are tough when you think about an NFL season. You look at it in the opposite direction. If a team drafted him that also had an interesting plan to limit total plays in a game, again, it's going to be a very minor element of it all, but it's not nothing. And so it'll be interesting to see just how creative the team is that selects him and how all of that goes. Ben, this has been a fantastic conversation. We're going to discuss some of the other positions using the same basic framework, go over some things through these lines. Hopefully listeners have enjoyed. This will probably be broken up into a couple of parts, and we'll see what we get as the recording schedule. But we hope everyone is excited for the conclusion of the 2024 season. We hope that you're doing well in your FFPC postseason contests. And obviously we're excited for new drafts, the prospect season, new rankings, all of those things that come with a new football season in the hobby that at this point never stops. This has been Stealing Bananas. I'm Shawn Siegele. With me as always has been Gretch. Make sure you get over and are signed up for his newsletter at bengretch.substack.com. We'd love to have you guys at RotoViz. The coupon code RVRadio2025 for 10% off your 1-year subscription. Leave us a rating review. That helps us a ton. We love you guys. We'll talk to you soon.